Hi, I'm Jahan Colbreth, Director of Federal Relations at the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. CHEA's upcoming annual conference, themed Quality Assurance Matters, will begin on January 29th and run through February 1st in Washington, D.C. We're also excited to present a series of 3 pre-conference videos. These videos bring together esteemed thought leaders in higher education to delve into compelling and timely topics. You can find our first pre-conference video on the CHEA website. But now, I'm proud to introduce our second video titled DEI and Religious Ideologies, Conflict or Companion. I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Beatty, Dr. Terrence Ford, and Dr. Jenna Dunn. With that said, Dr. Beatty, it's all yours.
Thank you. My name is Lisa Beatty, and I serve as Executive Director of the ABHE Commission on Accreditation. ABHE is recognized by CHEA as both an institutional and a programmatic accreditor, and the agency has been continuously recognized by the U.S. Department of Education since 1952. The Association for Biblical Higher Education is a faith-based accrediting agency that accredits or pre-accredits 127 institutions in the U.S. and Canada, accredits programs at 6 additional institutions, and supports the accreditation journey for 25 institutions currently in applicant status. ABHE institutions serve more than 60,000 students annually. Joining me for our conversation today are Dr. Terrence Ford, President of Southern Bible Institute and College in Dallas, Texas, and Dr. Jenna Dunn, Provost of Stark College and Seminary in Corpus Christi, Texas, and Chair of the ABHE Commission on Accreditation. Thanks to both of you for joining me today.
Thanks, Lisa, for the invitation to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm excited to have the conversation.
Well, I think context matters in these kinds of conversations. So I'd like to start, Terrence, and ask you to give us just a brief introduction to Southern Bible Institute and College.
Okay. Southern Bible Institute and College is a predominantly African-American biblical higher education institution founded in 1927 here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. Our mission is to equip men and women to be competent servant leaders with a Bible-centered worldview. Perhaps an important note about our institution that is relevant to this discussion is that we're newly accredited for the first time after 96 years of history. So that's who we are.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Jenna, how about you? Can you tell us a little bit about Stark College and Seminary?
Sure. Stark College and Seminary exists to equip educationally underserved followers of Christ for service in their church and community. We offer focused degrees in ministry and divinity and serve about 300 students across South Texas. A majority of our student population are non-traditional. About 60% of our students are over the age of 40. They're also ethnically diverse. As it relates to this conversation, 46% of our students are Hispanic and 20% are African American. And so multiculturalism is an institutional value and one of our programmatic objectives across all of our undergrad and grad programs is that our students depict culturally sensitive ministry leaders who value and celebrate diversity.
Wonderful. It's really helpful, I think, to get a sense of who's in the conversation and why you were chosen to be part of this group. Now that we know a little bit about your institutional contexts, let's jump into the topic, the relationship between DEI and religious ideologies. As a faith-based agency, I'm happy for the opportunity to address this issue. And up front, I think it's really important to note that diversity is not a new focus for ABHE. ABHE accredits both racially diverse institutions like Stark College and Seminary and minority-serving institutions like Southern. And so this has been part of the heritage of ABHE throughout its history. Historically, ABHE accreditation standards have included diversity issues in several areas related to institutional quality. So our current standards address DEI in 7 essential elements within our standards, and they're on these topics. So institutional culture and board governance, human resources, recruitment, student services, faculty qualifications, and curriculum. So we already in our standards address some of these issues that relate to DEI as part of those quality standards for which institutions are measured. So Jenna, since ABHE standards and practices already reflect a commitment to diversity, what was the Commission's motivation to further codify those commitments?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. In addition to being that current area of importance to ABHE, as you identified, there were really 2 motivating factors to further codify our commitment. First, the new CHEA standards that were approved in October of 2021, which require accrediting organizations to demonstrate that they manifest a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then second, the Commission actually began its comprehensive standards review process in early 2022. And one of the stated objectives of that entire process was to consider issues of diversity at both the standards and policy levels. Specifically, the review standards steering committee sought to input in 5 specific areas of focus, one of which was what revisions are appropriate to address the success of an increasingly diverse student population across ABHE institutions. And so both the new CHEA standards and the ABHE standards review process created a really great opportunity for ABHE to put our commitment to DEI into both policies and standards as an outflow of our mission to advance biblical higher education for kingdom impact. So while we pursued a specific policy related to DEI at both the association and commission, we also kept policy development in mind as we evaluated current standards of accreditation and then developed proposed standards.
That's a great summary of the conversations that we were having at the commission level. Now, it should not be a surprise to anyone that engaging in the process of developing a policy related to DEI in the current cultural context had its challenges, or at least its potential challenges. And so, Terrence, I wonder if you could talk about what challenges provided the context for the policy development work that we engaged in.
Unfortunately, the very terminology of DEI was an initial challenge at the outset of this development process of this policy. In a broader sense, this term has not only been highly politicized, but in many ways it's been weaponized, creating an unnecessary tension at its very mention. As a result, simply broaching this topic in many circles, including ours, it tends to set up polarization even before meaningful discussion can even begin. One of my responsibilities as a president is being on guard and attentive to regulatory and governmental requirements that appear to be perhaps misaligned with our missional purpose. The reason our 96-year-old historically Black institution did not even consider pursuing accreditation for the majority of those years was because of a deep-seated skepticism and hermeneutic of suspicion of an underlying intention or even language in regulations which would ultimately prove to be more of a hindrance than a help to the growth and impact of our college. What moved us forward to accreditation and the pursuit of it, particularly with ABHE, and I believe influenced ABHE's approach to developing this policy, is the belief that our shared faith values would somehow mitigate or at least suppress many of these tensions to allow honest efforts towards affirming a sense of belonging and accomplished success among its members. And I think a great example of that is the inclusion of the policy rationale section that was shared with our members that really helped to identify that shared value and desired for cooperation and acceptance of belonging and success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll talk about this more, but I think the approach of focusing on the ends and the outcomes of what it was that we were seeking to accomplish within our institutions was a really helpful way to frame the discussion for member institutions as we moved it forward. So in spite of some of the political challenges, the fact that we had state actions that were beginning to emerge related to DEI policies, and there's no accident that both of you are included from the state of Texas, because this was one of the states where this conversation became part of the context. But in spite of those challenges, the Commission was committed to working through the development of a policy that further articulated ABHE's commitment to diversity. So Jenna, as Commission Chair, what were your goals for the process?
Yeah, so the Commission wanted to create a process that was as inclusive and unifying as the policy we would develop. And so ultimately, in order to accomplish this, we had several goals. First, we wanted to ensure that we developed an appropriate policy that was rooted in the ABHE mission and biblical truth. We wanted to demonstrate the agency's commitment to these DEI concepts, specifically developing a policy that addresses the issues of difference categories that are contextualized within the mission and the theological convictions of biblical higher education. Second, we really wanted the policy to maintain unity among member institutions. And so though all ABHE member institutions agree to specific theological convictions, they are very diverse in size, type of institution, denominational affiliations, and constituency demographics. And so it's really important for us to ensure that the policy was not divisive among our member institutions. Third, we wanted the policy to be an example for how other faith-based organizations can approach DEI authentically and earnestly. We wanted to demonstrate our commitment to CHEA, our commitment to our theological heritage, and to show other faith-based organizations how DEI can be addressed from a missional and a biblical perspective.
No small task. There's a lot there, a lot of goals. As executive director, then, it was my job to develop a process to accomplish the goals that Jenna just described for you. And we took our time. This was almost a 2-year conversation from beginning to end. It began with some initial conversations with the ABHE staff, the association board, and the Commission on Accreditation. Just initial conversation about what it was we were seeking to accomplish. And out of that, they asked us to develop a draft of a biblical theological rationale for such a policy, and also a draft policy that would, from our perspective, address the concerns of CHEA as far as manifesting this commitment to DEI, and also the commitments that were already present in our standards, in our ABHE standards. So we worked to develop that rationale and that policy draft. The Commission also said we need broader representation to take a look at this than just the 19 people that are serving on the Commission. And so they charged me with establishing a task force that included institutional representatives across a spectrum of ABHE institutions, some representatives from the association board, and then of course the Commission as well. And one of the reasons that Terrence and Jenna are both on this call is because they served on that task force, so they'll be able to speak to some of that process. Task force met 3 times. They looked at our rationale and looked at the developed policy and made improvements. And I will have to say that I was so gratified at the end of that process with the strong affirmation of every single member of the task force for the results that had come out of those conversations. After that, we asked for some public comment on the policy, and we got input from the association board and then worked it through our commission processes. First, the review by the criterion committee, and then review by the full commission and approval. And so, Jenna, we've sort of buried the lead a little bit here by talking about the process before the product. But I want to give you an opportunity to talk now about what were the results of this process that we went through as an agency.
We ended with the policy on student success and institutional culture. And what this policy does is it seeks to ensure ABHE's commitment to student success and institutional cultures of belonging, and to ensure that those are rooted in and guided by the ABHE mission and tenets of faith, with a specific focus on student success and belonging as the degree to which an institution reflects differences within its constituency at all levels and in all policies, and supports the efforts of all students to achieve a common definition of success, ultimately manifesting a culture of belonging regardless of race, ethnicity, sex, age, or disability. And so we began the policy with a rationale that's really rooted in theological commitments, going back to our goals of developing a policy that was rooted in biblical truth and the maintenance of unity among member institutions. And so this policy rationale highlights 5 areas which we believe set a biblical foundation for taking DEI issues seriously. Each of these areas, and I will walk through them, have biblical evidence that support these 5 areas as a biblical foundation for DEI. And so the first of the 5 areas is the inestimable value of the individual, indicating the breadth of love God has for every human across all history as fashioned in God's image. The second area that we feel like is a biblical foundation for taking DEI seriously is the scope of the gospel, which outlines God's love for the world, calling for God's people to serve all tongues, tribes, peoples, and nations with the hope of the gospel. The third area of theological foundation for DEI is the call for unity in the body of Christ, not uniformity. The universal church is one body, and the Trinity reflects unity and the personhood within the Godhead that provides then a model for how Christians can be unified and provide Christian charity to one another in difference. The fourth theological foundation is that of the call for Christians to show hospitality and care to all. God is a loving and caring God who provides compassion and hospitality, and followers of God should show that same compassion and hospitality toward others. And then finally, we believe that God is just and merciful and compassionate, and Christ followers are expected to show that same compassion and mercy and justice toward others. And so within these 5 theological foundations for DEI, we wanted to extrapolate and emphasize several areas of commitment within the rationale, specifically focusing on fostering institutional cultures of belonging and the success of every ABHE student. And so ultimately, we really wanted to ensure that different categories are not predictors of student success. And so that leads me to the next attribute of the policy. We made a decision not to use that weaponized language that Terrence was talking about earlier that could potentially isolate and divide, but really focus instead on intended outcomes of a commitment to DEI, so specifically related to student success and institutional cultures of belonging. And so although there is merit in defining the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of biblical higher education, With constant shifts in the social and political context surrounding DEI, like Lisa mentioned, we really wanted to ensure that our policy didn't create challenges for ABHE institutions within their states and their communities. And so instead, we really focused on those outcomes, seeking to ensure the success of every student enrolled at an ABHE institution and fostering that success through standards, policies, and processes. In addition, ABHE institutions should reflect a vast array of differences with respect to race, ethnicity, sex, age, and disability. And so we ultimately aspire that difference characteristics are not predictors of students, employees, or trustees' sense of belonging or success at ABHE institutions. And then finally, we wanted to create measurable outcomes related to these policy goals that would be assessed by the agency as a part of its assessment plan. And so I'm going to ask Lisa to elaborate on those outcomes.
So we established 7 ways that we intended to manifest this commitment to DEI that CHEA had included in their standards. And here are those 7 things. Accreditation standards and policies that foster student success and institutional cultures of belonging within the context of biblical higher education. The second, accreditation standards and policies requiring institutions to identify missional difference categories present in their learning communities and demonstrate a commitment to supporting the success of all students. Let me unpack that for just a moment. The idea being that we want institutions to know who their students are. Do they have first-generation students? Do they have ethnic minority students? Do they have students who grew up perhaps on a mission field internationally and are experiencing the culture in the United States for the first time? Do we know who those students are, and have we built into our services and programs supports for those students to be successful in our contexts? The third area was accreditation standards and policies requiring institutions to assess student success in achieving institutional and program outcomes. Then the next have to do with, agency actions. Agency collection and disaggregation of our annual reporting data to assess its effectiveness in supporting student success at ABHE institutions based on race, ethnicity, and sex. So collecting data on completion rates, for example, that is disaggregated in some of these categories so that as an agency, we're holding ourselves accountable to whether or not our standards and policies are supporting the success of students in different categories across ABHE. And then in addition to that, ABHE leadership, so members of our commission, our staff, that reflect differences in race, ethnicity, and sex within our association membership in alignment with hiring and nominating policies. And then ABHE also has conferences, annual meeting presenters, leadership development opportunities. So we built into this policy that those presenters would reflect differences in, again, race, ethnicity, and sex within the membership of ABHE. And then also that our team evaluator pools and appeal pools would reflect those same differences. And we built those initiatives into our agency assessment plan, and we have begun to collect data in these areas. This is in process, of course, and we're just beginning to be able to compile some of this data, but our commission focuses on assessment of its effectiveness at its June meeting each year, and in June 2024 we'll have some new fresh data in some of these areas for the Commission to review and respond to. Terrence, as a member of the task force, now that we've sort of heard what the results were as far as policy, and perhaps as a member of the task force, but more importantly maybe a president of an ABHE institution, what are your thoughts on the results of our work?
Overall, I'm optimistic about the new policy being accepted and having a positive impact on our organization and on higher education. Um, it appears as though we have been able to establish a confidence of goodwill, which is, for me, an element that is vital in maintaining this goodwill throughout the life of the policy. In essence, there must be a belief that everyone involved and invested are sincere about the intended outcomes and will keep working the process with the results and stay on track with this. From a presidential perspective, I really do look forward to seeing the success of our college as well as our students gauged in the light of positive experiences of belonging as a member, an accredited member institution of ABHE and higher education. There is some skepticism in governance, among even our constituency. However, the optimism, I believe, will grow as long as this confidence of goodwill is sustained, and I honestly trust that it will do so. And so that is a positive kind of outlook that I have concerning this policy as a task force member and a president.
I appreciate those comments, Terrence. It is it's a big job as a commission or as a task force to tackle these issues, because they're not just organizational issues, they're not just institutional issues, they're personal issues, and they address experiences that people have had in contexts that perhaps were not welcoming, or situations in which a student had obstacles to success. And so I appreciate the hidden exhortation in your comments, Terrence, to not just take the development of the process seriously, but that as the commission and as the ABHE staff and accredited institutions, that we need to take the ongoing implementation of the policy very seriously, and the work of reviewing the results of the data that we find and continuing to make changes that would result in ever more welcoming environments for students and even more student success. So I appreciate those comments, Terrence. Jenna, how about you? Any additional thoughts on the process that we engaged in or the policy itself?
I really appreciated the intentional effort put forth by ABHE staff, the task force members, the commission, to treat this as an opportunity to celebrate the areas of DEI we already have ingrained in the ethos of ABHE, but also to take seriously really a critical look at how we can be better, how we can better measure student success and ensure all students across all different categories are succeeding, and that all constituents are made to feel welcome and as though they belong at ABHE institutions. I know that's easier said than done, as we've discussed. As a non-traditional minority serving institution, Stark really has sought to ensure that different student difference categories are not predictors of success. We've made efforts to ensure that our faculty, staff, and administration and trustees are representative of our students. Personally, as a female in theological higher education, I know how valuable it is to see my difference category represented in a faculty member, to be taught by someone who looks like me, has a similar background, has experiences like me. Stark has not always succeeded in these areas, but it takes conscious, continuous effort. It's ultimately worth it for the sake and success of our students and for our calling to serve all of God's kingdom.
And this is a start. We're beginning with a policy. We've got a set of initiatives that we're moving forward. But the reality is that we're going to learn some things along the way. And there may be changes to the policy. There may be additional things that we're going to want to track and be able to seek to address in our standards and policies. But I do think that the fact that we had really strong support from the policy as it related to public comment and also the approval of the commission and support from the association board. I really think this is a good foundation for the ongoing work that we all anticipate as part of this process. So I want to come back just a little bit and get a little broader view in light of the topic that CHEA gave to us as we started thinking through these ideas as it related to ABHE. And that topic title was DEI and Religious Ideologies, Conflict or Companion. So in light of our experience over the past 18 to 24 months, is it possible, from your perspective, for faith-based organizations to engage this topic in meaningful ways without creating conflict or mission dissonance? Or maybe you might want to answer it this way. What are some lessons learned or perhaps reinforced by our recent work? Let's start with you, Jenna. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah, and I already covered this when I talked about the rationale, but I really believe the biblical evidence related to the value of the individual and the call for unity in the body of Christ are representative of how DEI and religious ideologies can be companions. As I described earlier in the theological foundations from that rationale, I believe all humans were created by God in God's image and expressing God's diversity. Throughout the story of God's work with and through humanity, God consistently demonstrates a commitment to justice, mercy, and compassion. And the Bible often focuses on and features the plights of those who are different from society at large. This should be an indicator and an example for how we as Christians and Christian organizations should engage with their constituents and all of society. We are called to unity within the body of Christ, not uniformity. And so, though diversity exists, we should embrace and celebrate those differences and seek unity. Finally, Christ followers are called to care and hospitality, ultimately a commitment to inclusivity, as evidenced through our theological foundation, but specifically highlighted, I think, in the life of Jesus Christ. Though the terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion have become weaponized and often been portrayed as conflicting with religious ideologies, I personally believe they are evidenced in the Bible and should be expressed and practiced in the Christian walk. And I am proud to be a part of the process of the creation of the policy on student success and institutional culture, because I think it evidences that companionship.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. Terrence, anything to add?
First, I certainly endorse and agree with what Jenna has just shared. I think the root of our faith is really where it begins for us. And so I'm optimistic that difficult topics can be tackled without being divisive. And I also believe that, faith organizations can engage in these kind of topics without compromising our convictions. What we have to do is allow for flexibility and respect for diversity of values, that it will lend to a better cooperation, correlation, and achievement of shared objectives. But I believe that's an important aspect of this process, is to understand that flexibility, but nevertheless holding strong to our convictions and values. For me, more than a lesson learned was a lesson affirmed with regard to the notion that language is a powerful tool, both in creating and overcoming conflict. Finding common ground does not have to be derailed because there's a difference in the definition of terminology. Navigating around that, I believe, is an important aspect of getting to the shared outcome and the desired results. We have to get past the language barrier because that has become too divisive and too polarizing, and I think it's unnecessary in many instances.
I am so thankful for the wisdom and leadership of both of you in this process. And I will just say that I was very gratified by the engagement of lots and lots of people in the discussion. And, you know, for me, one of the lessons learned was the value of sort of setting some ground rules for conversation, creating spaces for people to have these difficult conversations, but in the context of relationship with one another, so that it isn't just, you know, sort of shouting across the wall. And I'm so thankful that even though we do have a great diversity of institutions across ABHE, and even differences among the way that they would express these concepts related to DEI, that we were able to have a very collegial conversation, and I think one that was unifying in its result, and of course we hope and pray unifying ultimately in its long-term outcomes as well. So let me just thank you both for your wisdom and perspectives on this important topic. I have sincerely appreciated your leadership throughout the policy development process, and I'm thankful for institutional leaders like both of you who are committed to supporting the success of every student and creating cultures of belonging at ABHE institutions. So thank you both.
Thank you, Drs. Beatty, Ford, and Dunn, for sharing your insight and knowledge in such an informative, thought-provoking conversation. We appreciate your dedication and your commitment to DEI. Well, tune in next week for our third and final pre-conference video as we discuss quality matters and quality delivery. Once again, I'm Jahan Colbreth, and we'll see you next week.